when Douglas told me at first that the conference would have been on Theosis and icons, being my studies on the Renaissance, one would think what icons have to do with the period. Indeed, this is not an icon, someone would say, even an expert could notice. And yet, as I reflected on that, I reflected that that one of the greatest painters of a specific period, Mannerism, of history of art, El Greco, was, for example, a great iconographer for half of his life. Then he moved to Spain, and then he developed his beautiful paintings, of which many of you will be familiar with. So that made me reflect on actually Mannerism as a liminal space. And as I am writing on a liminal figure of the period, in Pico della Mirandola, I reflected on this juxtaposition. Because the canon of classical art traditionally grown its perimeter to exclude both the tendencies of Mannerism and Baroque expression. Both of them were considered, in one case by European critics, to lack the purity and the balance of classical art, or in the other case, they were diffident about this style, describing it as crude and vulgar or exaggerated and unnatural. Think, for example, about the allegory with Venus and Cupid of Angelo Bronzino, in which you see the elongated neck of Venus, Cupid looking in this bizarre sexual position. This created a sort of disquietude in the later neoclassically leaning scholars of future periods. Yet in this there is an interesting juxtaposition with Pico della Mirandola, because Pico della Mirandola is a thinker that is also been thought by many to be confused and to be just a lot of complicated words and ideas about mixing a lot of different thoughts and creating synchronism, but we know a real conclusion. And also as the harbinger of modernity. So in the same way as Mannerism is the beginning of modernity, that it leads towards Baroque from the classical forms. So Pico della Mirandola, with his oration on the dignity of man, was seen as the beginning of the modern thinking on man, on what man, humanity are. So Mannerism finds an intellectual counterpart in Pico della Mirandola. Indeed, Pico perceives, according to their tradition, positively humanity, but I would add that in my interpretation, and not just mine, many scholars have looked at it, such as, for example, Copenhagen. They would describe Pico as giving to the human condition a marred character because of its ever-shifting nature. So because human beings are ever-shifting, because human beings can be both angels and animals, that is not a compliment. Chameleons are not good creatures in a classical understanding of symbols. It's a negative thing. It is indeed the sin of man to not have a direction like angels, a directions like the beasts or the animals, the beast in the language of Pico. And even in our more contemporary era, in reflection, the interplay between Pico della Mirandola's philosophical thought and Mannerist art endures in the forms of their reception through history. As noted by Wuntunen, we are at a time in which we strive to transcend the fragments of postmodern deconstruction. And in this light, Mannerism persists as a contentious enigma, because it doesn't have, like a postmodern deconstructivist would say, a fixed identity. Indeed, Mannerist art, as we will see looking at this painting, wants to create in you a sense of doubt or disquiet, questioning of the painting itself. So it resists the attempt to destroy deconstructionism, in a sense. Mannerist art, it resists it. And in the same way, Pico, because as an enigma, in his thought and in a way he writes, he may be both deconstructed or reconstructed in all sorts of shapes and forms, and indeed that has been the destiny of Pico since historiography on him began with More and even his nephew Francesco. So what I want to argue here with you is that following such a faint, steep track, we may truly grasp the spirit of this time preceding modernity's dawn, by dwelling in this mirroring phenomenon. In doing so, we may unlock some revelations about this transition from what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire, what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire that then is carried into Italy in the Renaissance art and then leads to modernity. By looking at the juxtaposition and the reflection of the thought of Pico in the art of Pontormo, we may unlock a way in which we are both inheritors of Eastern Rome and in general of the Eastern world in the West, but also of the distinctions that exist, the points of departure that exist in between the Orthodox world, the world of Byzantium, or the world of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the modern Western world, in looking at these figures. And these figures are really parallel, because just to say, Pico dies in 1494, and Pontormo is born in 1494. Pontormo is born very close. Pontormo, in fact, is the name of the city where he's born. He's born in close to Florence, and Pico is born in Mirandola, that is close to Florence, for nowadays times. With the train, it's a short ride, maybe an hour and a half on the regional train, if the regional train is on time. It is a rare thing in Italy, but otherwise it's a close place to it. So these two figures, one died and one born in 1494. What I wish to argue is that, for example, Pico's theory of cognition is reflected in the paintings of Pontormo. Now, I'm not arguing that Pontormo necessarily, that he ever says that he read Pico, but of course he was born in a Florence that was inescapably challenged and transformed, but all that happened just before his birth. The Florence of Ficino, the Florence that Lorenzo de' Medici had transformed, the Florence that had gone through Savonarola, the arrival of the French, the Florence that had been inhabited by Pico, and in which Pico was still a shining star, because that's a brief time in which Pico is still a figure that captures the intellectual minds of Florence. And we know that Pontormo, that was obsessive diarist, was very much influenced by Platonic ideas. And so it would seem to me inevitable, especially in light of my reading of the cognition of Pico in one of his most famous works. This is the Deposition of Christ, the Deposition from the Cross of Christ, that we can find in the Cappella Caponi, in the Chiesa della Felicità, that is a church in Florence. That it was commissioned in 1525. In this, I think, we can read the idea of cognition of Pico, and indirectly also some points of departure and some points of communality with some aspects of Orthodox iconography. I'm referring both to the challenge to hierarchical arrangement, but also to the similarity in non-realistic lighting that is present in his painting, and also to the overturning of symbolic gestures, that it needed been something that instead classical art of the Renaissance had inherited. So to speak about this, of course, I wish to give an idea that Pico della Mirandola is in many ways a man of the Renaissance. As much as he's a man that took much from the East, indeed he's the first one to learn as much as he can of the Western intellectuals, one of the first one to learn Hebrew and to learn directly from scholars that come from the tradition, particularly from Sicily and from Spain, to learn actually about Kabbalah, that was, to not be controversial on how old it is, because it's impossible to say, the unwritten mystical Jewish tradition. It was the first one to bring that into the Western frame of mind. He also was a person that, of course, absorbed partly by Ficino and partly by his own reading of Greek. He had a perfect Greek, and indeed he enjoyed the rediscovery of the classics that came from the exiles from Constantinople. Pico was a Platonist, indeed, but he was also a man of his time. He studied in Paris, he studied in Ferrara, and he was a man that at the beginning, when he, like all of us, went to university between 12 and 14. When he was at university, he had to study law. He discovered, like his mother wanted, as he was the third brother of a family of princes in the town of Mirandola. He decided he didn't want to be a lawyer after all, and he decided to go to Paris instead, first to Ferrara and then to Paris, to study philosophy. Indeed, Pico's views are deeply rooted in Aristotelian and scholastic teachings concerning the rational soul. His writings on cognition likewise encompass a broad array of cognitive faculties drawn from these traditions, among them the external and internal senses, or, as was said yesterday by Douglas, the idea of potential and agent intellects. Employing a theory of abstraction that he lifts directly from Aristotle, and subsequently he perfects with his learnings on even the Arabic tradition and the Jewish tradition, Pico unfolds a process beginning with the impression of an object upon the external senses, faithfully capturing the object's likeness. The internal senses then artfully turn this captured likeness in a mental image, a phantasm. And the phantasm is the mental image that you had. All this was the scholastic tradition that was much debated about the theory of perception that comes from the writings on the soul of Aristotle. There was much debated at the time. And this is indeed all Pican. In Picus, there is not a point of departure up to this point. So you will say you're just describing me as a scholastic thinker. However, in a departure from the customary distinctions that I just mentioned, that maintained a resolute separation between external and internal senses, Pico dares to bring together these two aspects, these two realms. This profound divergence reveals itself most strikingly in his novel approach to abstraction, where the orthodox Aristotelian school contends that the formation of a universal concept is a laborious process necessitating the construction of a composite image. The phantasm that I mentioned before, within the internal senses, Pico posits a more direct route. In his view, a universal image can be drawn forth directly from an image present within the external sense, a bold process that it may be called an immediate abstraction. So immediately, without all the laborious process of Aristotle, you have this capturing of the image itself within the observer, within the intellect, the agent intellect. Further, we may find other divergences that come from another aspect of Pico's thought, that was there was an exegete of scripture, and he was particularly interested in Genesis, on which he wrote the Heptaplus, but was also interested in the history of Exodus that he interpreted allegorically as in the Eastern tradition. So, for example, in Pico's reading of Moses' commandments, you may see a threefold pattern. The first is the entry to the sanctuary for those with new morals. So the reason why it is the sanctuary is a place like now you would say a nuclear power plant, in which there is only the scientists that can really approach it covered in the right way, otherwise it would get cancer and die. The sanctuary feels very much like that in the Old Testament. And the reason for Pico is because that's a moral, that's a metaphor of how only the person with the purified morals by grace can actually enter into the sanctuary. The second, that all the rules about the handling of the sacred items for those that are dedicated to it means the handling of dialectic. So learning dialectic and dialogical philosophy is a way to approach it. And the third, ordination to priesthood, means to, of course, to become a philosopher, because that's the ordination to priesthood in his thought. And then fourth, admission in the temple sanctuary means the beatific vision in the Savonarola tradition. So the idea that you will finally observe eye to eye, and that's why yesterday I mentioned to you that I would have recalled what you say. You will look eye to eye, the beatific vision, God. So I could say more also about how he uses Zoroaster to pick up these themes, but I'm conscious that there are other two much more learned speakers than me following, so I will, without further ado, continue on the specific reading I want to just oppose to this beautiful work of art, his altarpiece. So, to look at this, I would like to turn to a precise passage in the Ente Una, in which we read of the deposition, in which I think we can read the deposition from the cross of Pontormo. And Pico says, and I'm reading my own translation, so apologies if it's not as elegant as you would like. Sensible knowledge is imperfect, not only because it is an incomplete understanding, but also because it requires brute and physical organs, and because it touches only the surface of things, not penetrating to the inner substance. So the sensible knowledge, the knowledge that we all develop via the senses in the process that I highlighted above, is imperfect. Not only because it's incomplete, so not only because intellectually in itself is incomplete, because when you look at an object you will have just a partial understanding of it, but also because it's mediated via the eyes, it's mediated by organs, that in themselves our bodily organs are corrupted and brute. And because it's mediated by this, because it requires the brute organs, it can only touch the surface of things. It cannot penetrate the inner substance. So in answer to what we said yesterday, if the eyes can actually see the things, Pico would say no, because the eyes are organs, are brute, and they therefore cannot see the inner substance of things. They can only see the surface. So maybe you wouldn't say that you cannot have a vision of an angel, but would say that your vision cannot really penetrate the inner substance of the angel itself. And this also leads us, interestingly, both in a discussion about the meaning of icons and what icons can really do, whether they can lead to inner substance or not, and also lead into a conversation about iconoclasm and what do we do with images, because of this, Pico was understood as leading into this. Now, in contemplating this masterpiece of Pontormo, this, as I said, 1525 in Florence, this is an altarpiece that was commissioned by the Caponi family, a family of bankers from Florence that was based in Rome. They made a fortune by lending money in Rome, and of course they wanted 5 masses a day said for the souls, because if you are a Florentine banker at the time, they bankrupted the King of England even, you need to have 5 masses a day to make sure that your soul is not lost forever. So together with this painting came the salvation of the soul. So in contemplating this work of art, at first one is taken by the immediate and powerful visual impact of the painting, the vibrant colors that had just been restored. So I used the painting with the restored colors. These were exactly the colors as Pontormo would have liked them. If you had been even 10 years ago to see it in the chapel, the colors would have looked much darker. But these bright light colors, these pink, light blues, etc., is what Pontormo wants. So you can see also the powerful visual impact that they bring, the emotionally charged faces. Look at the faces of the 2 figures that are carrying Christ. They are the only 2 figures that are looking towards you, very much like in icons. You have always the eyes that seem to look you and follow in the room. If you go in the chapel, less maybe in here, but you can notice they look at you directly. They're the only 2 figures that look at you. Besides, on the corner, Pontormo is himself, the little green figure. He painted himself over that. And all the other figures are looking towards the Christ, the deposit Christ. Now, there is a sensory engagement and is moving, but there is also, because of the colors, a lack of depth. There is a lack of depth, because if you see how bright the colors are and how unnatural is the direction of the light, you cannot really understand the direction of the light that is fixed in all the figures. It gives you a sense of flatness. So there is a flatness to this painting that again recalls iconic imagery in the flatness and the unnatural use of lighting. What is unique, however, and a subversion of iconic imagery and of the imagery of the Renaissance, that I think he highlights what Pico says when Pico speaks of the fact that senses are brutish and the things of the world actually cannot convey spiritual reality, is something that you can notice. It's called the deposition from the cross, but there is no cross. There is no cross, and we have not even an idea where they are standing. There is not a bit of grass, a rock. There is just a cloud over there. Besides the cloud, there is no natural element whatever. We have no idea where these figures are standing. We can presume that there is a hill behind them because of how the figures are going up. But we indeed don't know if there is a hill, because it's not grown, it's not present. And also the figures are arranged in different sizes that seems to challenge our physical perception of things. For example, we know for sure, when you look at Renaissance art, and all of you will know that, you usually can perfectly understand the story, like for icons, by seeing what characters are doing. For example, we can know that the woman, the very big, enormous woman in size compared to all the others that is there, that looks desperate, is the Virgin Mary, because she is dressed in the Marian blue and she looks like a Marian character. But otherwise, the characters are subverted. For example, we have dressed in beautiful pink, and you can see only the back of her head, a Mary Magdalene that is depicted usually as a beautiful woman with blonde hair, exactly like that. But she's not holding, like usually she is, the water, as she usually does, the cup to wash Jesus when he finds on the tomb, like in the iconography of both icons and of Renaissance art. Instead, she is handing the veil of Veronica. So again, the veil on which the face of Jesus was left a mark and traditionally was carried. So again, there is a challenge, a subversion of the idea of what actually Mary Magdalene is, and is not a challenge to Mary Magdalene in herself, but is a challenge to the art of the time, a point of departure from a tradition inherited by the icons, at the same time as it's playing with the flatness of the icons and with the idea that looking in the eyes of the characters can convey you a powerful emotion. Other characteristic is that the characters are surprisingly unknowable, besides Magdalene and Mary. For example, the character on top of that has just one breast of a man and one of a woman on the very top in green that you can see. That is just because of the position that usually has in paintings, John the Baptist, the beloved disciple. So we can know that he's him just because of how he's leaning towards the body of Jesus. But otherwise, yes, besides the androgynous character, why is he up there, and what exactly is the emotion that represented? The emotion that represented is looking at Jesus from afar, like the beloved disciple by the death of Jesus feels separated and removed. The colours that he's wearing are the same of the dress of Pontormo, or the colours of Pontormo, green, so that Pontormo is identifying himself with the beloved disciple in the idea that we are both removed and close to the position of the body of Christ. The body of Christ is not carrying any markings of blood, like usually in Renaissance art. Look at it, it's just pallid and without any character of it. And who are these two that are carrying this body? Usually they should be older men, Joseph of Arimathea, for example, and Nicodemus. But they, of course, they're older men. Instead, these two look like the angels described in and also from the faces, etc. That are looking directly at you. They look like the angels that actually are found inside the tomb by Mary as Jesus is resurrected and says, "No, here." So it's interesting. Only the angels, so only the metaphysical inner reality the angels represent, are looking at the spectator. All the human figures are looking either at each other or towards Christ. Besides the angels, the only other character is Pontormo. And here we find another aspect. So all of this is conveying those ideas that, as I said, of Pico's understanding of cognition, this challenge to the body and the shape of the body, and the idea that the body can truly represent anything that is meaningful and real, because the shapes are out of proportion, the flatness is the flatness, the colours are colours that are not associated with the imagery, the bodies are androgynous, so everything that is material, and there are no cross, no landscape, so all of that is a challenge to materiality, to the body. So in a sense it's an iconoclastic painting in being a painting. And then there is the element of the spiritual reality, the inner knowledge, the inner cognition that only the angels can convey. And angels are an obsession of Pico. This ultra-mundane glance that Pico has in all his work is present in the glance of these two angels that are the only characters that you can look at, or these two figures that we don't know if they're angels because, again, another subversion. They have no wings, like in all the art of the time. And then we have Pontormo over there. Now, the face of Pontormo looks desperate and contrite. And this gives you the idea that this is not so much a deposition from the cross. I do not like the name because there is no cross. And usually the deposition from the cross, that's an important part of it. And it's not either a deposition from the cross, that instead of the paintings in which the body is put on the slab of stone. And it's not a pietà. It seems almost an after pietà. So the pietà is finished and the body of Christ has been taken away from the mother by the angels. So Mary looks desperate because the body of her son has been moved away. But you can see that there is a play with the Pietà imagery in both the position of Mary and the position of the body of Jesus. So it's almost an unraveling of Renaissance art. But what it is in particular is the inner journey of the soul, taken by the grace of the death of Christ, the carrying of the weight of sin, carried there. Even the angels are desperate. In the St. John Chrysostom liturgy, in the Orthodox liturgy, there is the passage that says, "Oh, the angels and the archangels are surprised at the marvel that is said at Easter by the ascent and the death of Christ. They themselves are shocked and surprised." And there is the shock of the angels that carry the weight of God dead on top of them. And all of this, however, is not in an external world in which, like in Byzantine art and also like in Renaissance art, the landscape is framed, the landscape matters, but the landscape has disappeared, and the only element of what is the landscape is the Pontormo there that says the landscape is his mind, is his soul, saved by grace, that can perceive the inner reality. Thanks to the death of Christ, he can feel like John, that is the same colours as him, that the figure top on green, on top of that, he can feel like John, he can feel like the despair of Mary, he can feel that the weight of the death of Christ is the weight of our own sin, and therefore turn towards interiority, towards the interior journey, towards the anxiety of discovering grace within you. Am I saved or am I not saved? That is a character that is typically associated with Reformed thought. In this sense, I think that in Pico della Mirandola, there was the beginning, never realized, of an Italian Reformation, because too close to Rome for that to be possible, that is different but also in some ways similar to the Reformation in other parts of Europe, but that survives in some, as I discussed many times with Douglas, it survives in some ways in England, because England, having this latitudinarian spirit, allows for this currents from Italian humanism and philosophy to come and being considered, especially by poets and artists, and in just a larger country than the Protestant countries, that allows for this plurality. But at any rate, an Italian Reformation present in Pico, that in Pico doesn't survive, because Pico goes through, whether he was aware of it or not, of the markings of being excommunicated and then having to apologize to the Pope, the markings of being this really juncture figure in between Savonarola and Ficino. He was friend of both. What a unique thing, because they hated each other, and yet Pico was friends with both. And yet survives, I argue, in Mannerist art. This Italian Reformation, never realized, survives in the art of Pontormo, and we can find it also, I think, in Rosso Fiorentino and in very few artists, as if something that couldn't anymore be said with words could still be translated or find an expression of a spiritual journey in art and painting. And here I would conclude, because, yes, I could say more.